Well, I'm excited to be with you, very excited. I came all the way down from Gainesville, Florida, home of the mighty Gators. I want to shout out to the people in the panhandle of Florida as a Choctawhatchee High School graduate. Can I get some big green Indians out there? Yeah, right. I just graduated a Bobcat in Gainesville. My son graduated about, yeah, right. And it turns out Pomp and Circumstance is the longest song ever when you have over 500 in a graduating class. They walk in 2 by 2. So I got a sense of what Noah was dealing with in the ark, but without the annoying song. And then, I just met for the first time as an adult Justin Flights. So he came up and introduced himself. He's a Gainesville guy too. And he was in 9th grade, and I was coaching him back when I was a young man and had hair. And he didn't even remember that, from baseball. So it's been a walk down memory lane here today. I'd like to have an honest conversation with you this afternoon about engagement. I made a present of a book that I was fortunate enough to be a part of called Humanizing the Education Machine. And there's some things in that book about student engagement that I think are relevant. It's interesting, we have another book coming out this winter about teacher engagement, because it turns out that just around the corner from student engagement, if you actually want to get serious about that, we're going to have to talk about something else. But I want us to maybe set a mental framework in place today that might be helpful for you in your work and thinking through what are the challenges of engagement and what are the things we're not talking about, like the stuff we don't talk about that we should talk about, and then how would you lead learning at your school or lead innovation at your school. So that's kind of the roadmap of where we're going to go today. I'm also the CEO of a company called Meteor Education. There's some of our environments are sitting around here because we believe that there is an intersection between engagement and environments. And we operate at that intersection as an organization, and would always be happy to talk to you about that. But that's not what we're going to talk about this afternoon. I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. First of all, I am a chemist by training. When I tell people that, I usually don't get a reaction. That's as good as the jokes will be all day, so if you didn't enjoy that one, it's not going to get better from there. I have 3 patents in cosmetic chemistry. It's likely, if you're wearing color cosmetics, and particularly the kind that stay on your face for a long time, that some of my chemicals are on your face today. From there, I made the very reasonable career jump into the lucrative world of school furniture in 2001. My partner, who bought the business with me, was a civil engineer, and so the joke goes, a civil engineer, a chemist, a priest, and a rabbi buy a furniture company. You can put whatever punchline you want to in from there, and it gets funny. And then I got involved with a group called the Association for Learning Environments many years ago that really study how do learning environments come alongside as a tool to impact learning along with methodology and the tools that we bring into the classrooms. I'm actually part of the staff that does online courses for that group as well. I did have the authorship of Humanizing the Education Machine, and then I am my 3rd degree black belt with 4 world titles. Currently, I'm the 2018 reigning champion in the over 65 category. I lied, and that's kind of how you win. You just, doctor, not really. That's not me, but you can take any bald guy and stick him, in a gi, and we all look alike, so, Let's talk about engagement for a minute, and before we do, I'm going to ask you to do something for me at your table. How many of you think you know what engagement is? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. How many of you think the people at your table and you will agree on what engagement is? So we're going to take a second, and I want you to just talk, just for a second at your table. Okay, I'm going to give you about probably more like 5 minutes because there's no way I'm going to give you any less than that. And I want you to turn, I want you to talk about what do you think engagement is? Okay, so look at the people at your table. We're going to turn and talk to one another and talk about what do I think engagement is. So here's a moment of reflection for you. I just want you to reflect on this for a second then. Did you have a consensus right off the bat, or were there lots and lots of words that were being batted about the table? Lots and lots of words. Let me ask you, if you did that same exercise in your school, do you think your teachers would be cogent around the idea of engagement? Do you think your staff at your school would understand when you use the word engagement what you're saying? Because we use a lot of buzzwords in education, and so one of the things I believe as a constructivist, so I'm an educational constructivist, is that you have to create a mental model. So I want to help us create a mental model. Maybe this is a way that would help you and your team to start to think about the idea of engagement. So let's get on the same page first. First of all, did you notice that I didn't ask people on this side of the room to go talk to people on this side of the room? I asked you to do what? Do it at your table. And it was still problematic for some of you because these are actually kind of large tables. Did you note that? And I heard some of you talking so softly. Right? And we have how many people at this table? A lot. Did you guys have any trouble hearing something that somebody was saying as the collaborative hum started to grow in the room? There were some people at the table you're like, no, there's never a problem hearing that person talk. But then there might have been somebody it was a little hard to hear. I want you to understand that engagement, one of the things that's important to us is the proximity in which we're asked to engage. Have you recently gotten on a webinar or a remote meeting of some kind? Is it easy to engage and stay engaged on a remote meeting? No, because my email's right there. And, there's so many other things. I can look at the screen and look like I'm paying attention, but I'm not really paying attention. Proximity, as it turns out, is a very human thing. Tribal connectedness. And so the idea of proximity matters when we start to think about the idea of making a connection. We have to think about how do our spaces or how do we connect people in proximity. That's one expression of how we start to move toward this idea of engagement. The second thing we have to think about is this idea of social connection. So how many of you were sitting next to somebody you like? How many of you would admit it if you weren't? Or somebody you didn't know? See, if I was sitting next to people I didn't know, it took a few seconds for me to even figure out how we might start to tackle the task I was just given, right? Versus the people I work with every day, I can just kind of go in like it's any kind of dialogue because there's some level of social connection. And it turns out that the psychological safety that you felt or didn't feel at your table either inhibited or helped you progress in terms of your engagement around the topic. So social connection is important, and it's kind of different to feel psychologically safe with the people you're with. You're willing to start to take risks that you wouldn't take if you don't feel psychologically safe. Additionally, we have to have an emotional connection of some kind to the thing that we're talking about. So how many of you love the NBA and are watching the finals? Love professional basketball. What did you think last night about that Kevin Durant being in the game? And was that a good play or I
had zero thoughts because I don't.
Because she doesn't love the NBA, do you think she and I could have a serious conversation and think deeply about this subject together?
No, you want to talk to someone.
No, you'd want to talk to somebody who actually had an emotional connection. Now, I want you to think about that for students for just a minute. I'm not emotionally connected to the thing you're trying to enact on me. So it's important that we have the proximal connection, the social connection, and the emotional connection before we try to move somebody toward cognitive connection. Once we start to get them cognitively connected, they're thinking more deeply about something, all of a sudden we could call this, instead of engagement, we might use a word like immersion. But notice how many elements of the human being are involved in immersion. Now we talk about it this way: mind, body, and what? Soul. That's what these connections are. Proximity, body. Social, emotional, mind. Cognitive, right? Our thinking. This is how we think about the idea of immersion. This is a way for us to think about a mental model then to say, does this student, is this group of students, is my teacher immersed? That's just kind of a place that we want to start. So here's the good news. Don't you love getting up and reading these headlines in the paper? It's like it's better than a cup of coffee in the morning. It's a nice kick in the gut when it gets up and your school district is listed there, right? Here's why $7 billion can't help the problem. It turns out that when we look at a 40-year run of what it costs us to educate a student, normalized for inflation, the costs are 200% more than they were 40 years ago, and we do it with 100% more staff. And the bottom three lines down there are our reading scores, our math scores, and our science scores over that same period of time. And my question to you is, as a business person, would this be what you would call a good return on investment? When we ask parents questions like this, what do you consider most important in judging the effectiveness of your child's school? The number one answer is that my child is positively engaged in what they do. And number two, that they're hopeful about their future. Look at what number three is, that they graduate from high school. Look at number four, that they go immediately to college or get a job. We call that what? College and career ready. And how about scoring well on a standardized test? The problem right now we face is that the system is set up to work how? Completely the opposite of this graph. Get a good grade on your standardized test so you can be college and career ready. And if you happen to be hopeful about your future or you happen to be engaged while you're there, that's a bonus. But parents don't see it that way. See, it turns out that all the things we say we want, when superintendents are asked, top of mind, number one thing, what's their answer? In a national survey, it's graduation rate. What's the number one predictor of graduation rate? Student engagement. When we talk about students getting through high school, or when we talk about students doing well in school, when we talk about standardized, what we're talking about is engagement and immersion. And it's something we call a leading indicator. See, lag metrics are things you get up and read about in the paper. Like when the test scores come out in a few weeks, right? That's a lag indicator. It tells you about history. It doesn't predict anything about the future. But do you know what student engagement does for us? It tells us things about what's likely. That's why we would call it a leading indicator. It's a really important thing for us to think about measuring. And how many of you have ever heard of a measure of student engagement? If there were such a thing, we would be in love with it already in education, because if anything, we are in love with our numbers. So here's some numbers. When students are asked about their engagement progressively from the time they're in middle school on through high school, do you know what we find? I have fun at school. I learn something interesting at school. I get to do what I do best every day. What happens progressively from elementary to middle school to high school? It's a progressive, decelerating engagement in most children's life. But what was the number one criteria for parents in judging the effectiveness of their children's schools? Engagement. And if I watch this graph go on in my child's life, it is no wonder that when we think about confidence in public schools and what we can look at there, that it seems like people are losing confidence. But there are things we can do to turn this around. It's called creating a different kind of curve. Instead of a decelerating student engagement, what if we could do something different? Well, here's part of our problem. We're a little schizophrenic right now. I know you know this already, but this is a district mission statement from XYZ school district who will remain nameless, but they are real. And I want you to look at what it says their mission is. To do what? Improve student achievement so that they can graduate and be college and career. You can't make this stuff up. What is this? This is the graph backwards, right? And to do this for every student so that they're all ready to go to college or they're all ready to get into a career, we have a view of how we do that, what education looks like in that kind of place. And sometimes it feels like this. And the problem is there is a presupposition about how human beings learn behind this. And it's about deep inside, we don't recognize the uniqueness of the individual, the journey the individual's on, because we've got to get them all through at a certain point in time and at a certain place. But the same district has a vision statement. And I want you to look at their vision statement, because the vision statement says that they want to create supportive, engaged learning experiences that are personalized, that involve passion and inquiry and exploration and collaboration and innovation. And it doesn't even sound like the same people wrote this. This was a different committee, wasn't it? This was the other committee. Because education looks different in that arena if that's really going to be the vision of what you deliver. And here's the schizophrenia. Which is it? What do you really believe about people? What do you really believe about students and how they learn best? And so this is a futurist friend of mine said this, and when he said it, I jumped all over it. But I honestly believe our role in educating is no longer technical and industrial and trendy. It has to do with preparing people to be uniquely human in an ever-increasing, dehumanized world. And I want you to pause for a minute and just think, is that really what's happening in our classrooms? Is that really what we're prioritizing in education? So we've got lots of data points. We've got Tony Wagner, who wrote a book called The Global Achievement Gap in 2008, and he says there are 7 survival skills of 21st century workers, things like critical thinking and problem solving and collaboration across networks and analyzing information and all kinds of good soft skills that we talk about on a regular basis, right? Human skills. I want you to look at the human skills that are present on this list. And I want you to think about what the World Economic Forum tells us about what's the 10 most desirable skills of kids coming out of school today and how it's changing very rapidly as we move from 2015 to what they're saying the 2020 list looks like. And look at where creativity is. And then I want you to think about this idea of what does it mean for students to thrive? Because if we were looking at thriving students and saying thriving is a goal of ours, right? What does that list start to look like? Passion for learning, desire to serve and make a difference, a child who can bloom where they're planted, creative and divergent thinking, effective life habits. What I want you to realize about what we're looking at is this is about relationship, this isn't about transaction. And in education, sometimes we think that we're transacting something. I'm transacting knowledge into this child's life, when in point of fact, the relationship matters because education is first and foremost and always will be permissive. You ever tried to learn something from somebody you didn't trust? You ever tried to take risks with people that you have no relationship with? If we believe anything about immersion, if we believe anything about how human beings live, we have to first understand that education begins in relationship, not in transaction. And if that's true, I was always taught to keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. We win or we lose at the relationship. And I want to demonstrate this to you just for a minute because we talked about this idea of decelerating engagement. How many people know what a flywheel is? We know what a flywheel is, right? It's a big, heavy wheel. Takes a lot of inertia to get going. But once that flywheel gets going and you go to put your finger in it, what happens? You lose a finger. You can't stop a flywheel once it gets going. At the same time, if a flywheel is decelerating and slowing down, what do you think it takes to get the flywheel going again? A lot of inertia. I want to propose to you just, again, one more mental model to think about when you start to think about how could I create accelerating engagement? What would that look like? So we just said we win and lose at relationship, and I want you to think about the idea of relational engagement as the thing that you've got to do best and first if you want to create a flywheel of engagement. And what I mean by relationship in this is that I have to take care of the student and teacher relationship. I have to take care of the student's relationship with one another, and I have to make the content relatable to the student because they have to have relationship to the content as well. If I don't do that first, and I say we're going to move to cognitive engagement next, am I going anywhere? And I want you to think seriously, am I winning at relationship in the classroom right now? Are my teachers winning at relationship? Are we winning at relationship of the kids with each other, and are we winning at the relationship that they feel to the content? It's kind of three little fronts to work on there. If we get that right, and I trust you, and I am engaged in the thing you're talking about, now you can start to speak into my life something a little bit more difficult about that subject. Now DOK matters. And we start to go to a different depth of rigor. And so when I am cognitively challenged about something I haven't thought about before, what is my natural reaction? You just told me something I hadn't even thought of before. And what's very natural that happens inside of people when they get curiosity? Did I hear that? I get curious. What's a good sign I'm curious? I ask a question. 2011, the most recent work on agentic engagement, or the idea of agency, which is now out and viewable, is really dealing with, we talk about it as ownership sometimes, students taking ownership, but it's really just about them asking questions. And I want you to think about the classroom dynamic where we've gotten past the relationship and we've now done something that inspired the student. And little Johnny says, you know what? I have a question. Why does it work that way? And the teacher says, I'm sorry, it's not in the standard. We can't go that far, little Johnny. We've got to move on. What just happened to the relationship with me and little Johnny? And there went the flywheel. But what happens if I take time with little Johnny and the kids in the class with little Johnny to explore that just for a minute? What just happened to our relationship? Did it get a little better? Can I go a little deeper? If I go a little deeper, are you going to ask another question? If I help you explore and answer that question, did our relationship just get better? What's happening? We're turning a different kind of wheel, aren't we? We're creating a flywheel of engagement. It's a mental model. Just wanted you to have it. Second part. Let's all stand up. Because there's nothing like being at one of these conferences in the afternoon after my chocolate chip cookie and a little bit of coffee that makes me want to just check out and be done. So, move around for a second. I'm a big, move around kind of person. And then whenever you want to, you can sit back down. You don't have to sit down right away. You can stand up. These are big monitors. So I want us to think about what aren't we talking about, because if I just said, and I did, that we win or lose with relationship, then we got this thing licked, right? So it turns out that everybody in this room and probably in this state and in education has gotten the memo that teacher as the hub of content is out, right? It's passé. We don't do it that way anymore. Here's an inescapable fact. The teacher as the hub of culture in a classroom is inescapable. It's that old piece of Greek literature that says when the student is never above his teacher, but when he's fully formed, he will be like his teacher. And it turns out that if we win or lose at relationship, then we've got to add something in here to student engagement, which you already probably suspected was coming, which is what is a leading indicator of student engagement? If the student is not above his teacher, but when he's fully formed, he will be like his teacher. Teacher engagement. Shoo! I'm glad that's over, because we're in good shape on teacher engagement then, right? So it turns out this is why this is so important. You can't read this. I'm going to read parts of this to you. The SOLs, this is this particular set of student achievement tests, do not test what makes each of you unique, special, and smart. The people who create these tests and score them do not know each of you the way I have come to know you or the way your families know you. She continues, the scores will give you from these tests will tell you something, but they will not tell you everything. There are many ways of being smart. You are smart. You are hardworking. You are enough. You brighten my days. You bring a smile to my face. So while we are preparing for the test, and in the midst of all, take a deep breath and remember there is no way to test all of the amazing things and awesome things that make you you. I love you for being you. Who doesn't want this teacher teaching their child? Right? I want this teacher to teach my child. Why? Because this teacher understands I win with what? Relationship. How many of you have seen this TED Talk? Do schools kill creativity? Most watched TED Talk of all time, right? 40 million hits. I mean, who hasn't already been to a conference and gotten to hear Sir Ken Robinson? I'm sorry I can't do the English accent and sound smarter, but he's great, right? Here's our problem. It turns out that our schools, if we're being brutally honest, are actually killing more than creativity. Schools are literally killing people in them. And this is what we're not talking about. When we look at the teaching profession today, it is tied with nursing among the highest rated stress professions in the United States. The health and well-being of our teachers and where we sit today then is likely not in good shape, because it turns out that stress has some pretty nasty impacts on our body. In fact, stress, when you're under maximum cognitive load on a regular basis, it affects every system of your body. Your brain, your cardiovascular system, your reproductive system, your immune system, the gut, the skin. Everything about your body is negatively impacted by chronic stress. And it turns out there's and you know what this one is, but there's a chemical that's released in chronic stress called what? Cortisol, that's linked to some of the nastiest diseases we deal with all the time. Diabetes, osteoporosis, obesity, high blood pressure, digestive disorders, infertility, and rare diseases on top of that. And if 46% of our teachers are dealing with things like sleep deprivation, which they are, and chronic stress. And by the way, what does sleep deprivation do to you over a period of time? Have you read the recent articles on sleep deprivation? What's your cognitive processing capability when you're dealing with chronic sleep deprivation likened to? Being under the influence of alcohol. You have the same cognitive processing capabilities in sleep deprivation that you do when you're at the legal limit. Now, I want you to think about that for just a second when we send teachers into the classroom knowingly with sleep deprivation at the same cognitive processing abilities of people who are drunk. And then when we start to see teachers are cutting a student's hair or flipping out on a child, we begin to see maybe there's a pattern here. And it turns out there are 4 big sources of teacher stress, according to some amalgamated studies that Penn State has looked at. The first one is in school organizations that lack strong principal leadership and a collegial work environment. John Hattie says it this way, collective?
Teacher efficacy.
He sure does.
Yes.
Number 2, the job demands themselves. They're escalating. Education has not gotten simpler, it's gotten more complex. It turns out that those escalating demands, when mixed with the cocktail of limited resources, lead us to some pretty bad information. And the last thing is the teacher's own ability to recognize what's happening. We talk about social and emotional learning with who? All the time now. Kids. Who are we missing in the conversation about being aware of their own social and emotional state? Children. What happens when I go under max cognitive load, even as an adult, to the prefrontal cortex? It shuts off. And one of 2 things happens. I either become highly reactive or I become disengaged. I detach. Question, which of these are good in a classroom? It's like Sophie's choice. Neither one, right? Neither of these are good for classroom dynamics. When we start to look at longitudinal studies about what these kind of classrooms where teachers are experiencing high levels of burnout do for students and learning, guess what we find? Students who begin the school year with weaker math skills and have teachers that are more burnt out have the lowest rates of achievement. Does that surprise you? Of course not, because we win and lose at relationship. A second study that looks at children who have lower levels of social and emotional adjustment and academic performance are linked and correlated to teachers that are what? Highly stressed. And in the, if you will, opposite study, we found that teacher engagement predicts student engagement, which predicts outcomes. There's the study. But perhaps most damning of all, in looking at morning elementary school students and measuring cortisol levels in morning elementary school students, we could predict at better than 50% correlation what the kids' cortisol levels were going to be based on what? The burnout rate of the teacher. In other words, my stress just became what? Little Johnny's stress. And bad news, chronic cortisol on little Johnny has a lot longer to work on his health during particularly important formative physiological years. How bad is it? We ask teachers the question, are you engaged in what you do? 1 out of 3 teachers tells us I'm positively engaged in what I do. Nearly 50% of teachers, a little bit more, say I'm actively or kind of passively disengaged. And about 10% tell us that they're leaving the profession as soon as they can. What's a real practical expression of this? Well, you deal with this as administrators. How many more work days do you think an engaged teacher works a year than a passively disengaged or an actively disengaged teacher? Well, they actually did the math, and it's 2.3 million sub-days a year for those that are either passively disengaged or actively leaving the profession. That's just one expression, because there's such a thing as presenteeism too. They're not absent, they're there. So there were some studies done in England, the Whitehall studies, and they looked at people who were in positions of authority and then down the chain. They said, you know what? People that have high cognitive demand like leaders, but high levels of autonomy in dealing with that stress, it turns out that they're some of the healthiest people that you're ever going to find. But those that have high cognitive demand, that have low autonomy in dealing with it, are among the most unhealthy people on the planet. And it turns out that as you move down in government organizations, who are the most unhealthy people? The workers. And I want you to think about this in your own teaching experience, because you used to teach. Most of you, if not all of you, used to teach. So you get up in the morning, and if you're typical in the education profession, 90% of elementary teachers are what? Women. 70% of people in education are women. So let's just take the ladies' example for a moment. So I got up, I'm probably the primary caregiver. Who's going to make sure little Johnny has their lunch? Who's going to make sure the permission slip got signed? Who's going to make sure that the homework is in the bag and that Johnny put on clean underwear and brushed his teeth? Then I've got a stressful commute to work. Then I get out of the car and I go immediately to the car line because it's car duty today, Yahtzee, and then I'm going to go through a crowded hallway while the bell's ringing so I can go in and go to class. And by the way, for the next 3 hours, don't plan to go to the bathroom because you can't leave. Now, you can do complex brain surgery in this country, and you can have a person's brain cracked open on the table and take a bathroom break. But you can't do that as a teacher. And then because you've got some of these kids that are struggling, you're going to give up half your lunch to work with little Johnny and little Sammy to make sure that they get a little bit of extra help. And then you're going to do this all over again in the afternoon before you go to the faculty meeting, where you hear about the new district's policy on picket. And then I've got to get to the store so that I can get the stuff for dinner, so that I can get home and get dinner cooked. And then I get a call from mom who says, Dad is, once again, got issues. And you're the primary caregiver for your parents too. And then you collapse into bed and you do it all over again. And so shockingly, 40% of our new teachers leave the profession in the first 5 years. Now, there's a real cost to that, because every time we have to go out and recruit new teachers, guess what? It costs us money. Time and training. Have you ever put a lot of professional development into a teacher only to have them say, I'm out of here? Ouch. Because you were going to be my instructional coach of the future, and I just lost them. And so this is what we're facing sometimes, right? But it turns out this is a story that's not a cartoon. So when we talk about teacher engagement, I think we're talking about the wrong thing, or teacher disengagement, because what we're really looking at is people that are burned out oftentimes and demoralized. But here's the challenge. How does that student process a demoralized, burnout teacher in the classroom? What does it look like to a child? It looks like, I don't like you. The problem with that is we win or we lose where? At relationship. In a recent survey in LA Unified, middle school students reported, 70% of middle school students reported they have at least one teacher that, quote unquote, hates them. Now, I don't believe that. But do you know what that child's experience of their teachers is? This is from a teacher's blog. Recently, looking back, I had seen the signs as far back as September of last year. I had a nasty sinus infection that wouldn't completely go away, agonizing headaches that felt like they were boring through the center of my skull for days at a time. And still, when you commit to a job like teaching, it can take over your whole life, and so I let it. I loved it. I was good at it. I worked at a supportive school for an appreciative boss who respected my ability and work ethic, so how did I let it go so horribly out of proportion? She continues, the workload wasn't what finally broke me, but it certainly reduced my, what's the word? Resilience. What did it was a culture shift. The day I broke, I was called in to see the boss regarding the wording of some internal email of minor importance after a fantastic working relationship based on years of mutual respect. I stood there listening to him, red in the face, berate me for something so apparently minor I couldn't believe it warranted a conversation. And resisting the impulse to say what I really thought, which we all have to do sometimes, right? I walked out of the door, never to return. I taught my last day's lesson, phoned my general practitioner, and by 5 p.m., I had an emergency appointment, signed off on stress in less than 10 seconds of sitting down in the office, and this person left the teaching profession never to return. Now, I'd think this is isolated if I hadn't just read the same story about 3 weeks ago that a teacher posted in Florida, because this was in England, but it could have been anywhere. This is what we're not talking about. And it turns out that if we thought of our teachers in some way as athletes as opposed to others, I mean, how many people question the decision, if you even know about the decision, to put Kevin Durant on the court with an injured leg, and he's now done something to his leg that probably will keep him out next season, and you look at that coach and you say, stupid coach, stupid trainer. What do we do when we put teachers day after day after day in the classroom without a thought of recovery, without a thought of where they're at from a health perspective, day after day after day, and we're the coach and we're the trainer? Stupid trainer. Bad coach. We have to get around this conversation in our schools. And here's the question that teachers begin to ask themselves after years. Am I giving out of my essence instead of out of my overflow? Because I can't give out of my essence forever. So what would I do about this? How would I lead innovation at my school? Because here's a funny little secret. Is it easy to innovate in a group of people that are burnt out and demoralized? That's not easy. It turns out it's darn near impossible. So how would we fix it? Well, in the book you have, one of the things we talk about is a taxonomy of schools toward the end of chapter 4. Taxonomy being a way of thinking about or naming where are we starting from. Because it turns out all schools, as we looked at our research, were not created equally, but we're all trying to get to this place of future ready. And as we looked at schools around the country, we found a group of schools that I would call left behind schools. In the book we talk about, these are custodial schools. In some cases, these are just places that we're holding the kids until we incarcerate them, after we get them through. Low socioeconomic status. That school and the strategies in that school and the kind of trauma that teachers and students face in that school may be a little bit different than in the land of the Lexus and the minivan. It might turn out that we have some schools that are really good at passing tests. We found those. They were called Wellschooled, poorly educated. In other words, these kids aren't developing the soft skills that they need, but they can pass tests and they can get into college. They're no more ready than the kids coming out of left behind schools to actually engage life, but they're well schooled. And then we found what it took to be future ready schools. As we think about that, and we think about this idea of transforming education, it seems like it's this complicated, right? You think about all the strategies that you hear about how we're going to innovate and transform education, it feels like this. And when I ask people, who's responsible in your school or in your district for changing education and innovating, I get usually one of two answers. The first one is this: that guy, that gal, the Chief Innovation Officer. What a fun title that is, right? Whoa, who got that one? Or the other one is, we're all responsible for it. And we're all doing our own thing and making funny noses and poking each other in the eye, and it looks pretty discoordinated. But it turns out we've got lots of good data on how you get high-performing teams to innovate. And as a leader, I want to at least give you a way of thinking about this. I want you to think about the kind of issue that you're facing day after day and what the issue might be and what kind of leader you have to be in that. So I'm going to give you 3 kinds of issues, and then we're going to talk about what kind of problems they are. First of all, there are tactical problems. Tactical problems are technical issues that we pay subject matter experts to come in and solve for us, or we ourselves are subject matter experts and we can solve them. And it's about 80% of your day most of the time. And a lot of people rise in leadership because they're good at solving tactical problems. We got a problem. I know a guy. Strategic issues, on the other hand, are questions about where are we going in the future, and a lot of times it's external factors that are weighing on the situation that are causing us to think about different directions. That's about 10% of how leaders spend their time. And unlike being in a tactical situation where I know a guy, as a strategic person or in a strategic situation, I actually have to help cast a vision as a leader. And the third kind of problem is what we call an adaptive problem. And these are when we have complex organic systems that are interconnected and we have values that are in conflict, like are we ever going to do standardized tests again, or do we care about student engagement? That's a complex hairball, isn't it? That's an adaptive challenge. And it turns out that most leaders are least good at what? Adaptive challenges. So I want you to think about these in terms of light bulbs, crossroads, and chasms. Light bulb problems. The light bulb went out. What do we need to do? Change the bulb. This is a tactical problem. Either I know how to change the light bulb, which is unlikely in today's modern facilities, or I know a guy, or I know where to go to get the light bulb changed, right? Tactical problems are characterized by things I can write checks to do. I just need to write a check. I make a policy, I write a check, I get a person in, tactical problem done. Crossroad problems. What kind of problems are these? Do we go left or do we go right? This is the strategic question. Well, a lot of times, and even in your own districts, don't you already know where you want to go? I mean, even the district we looked at earlier, the XYZ public school district, had a vision statement and they knew where they wanted to go. So casting that vision, here's where we're going to go left or here's where we're going to go right, is the role of the leader here. But then there's these. These are chasm problems. And it turns out that chasm problems are things that you don't know how to do as a leader. And in fact, probably nobody in your organization knows how to do. In other words, how do we actually get people to do this? It's not that we don't know where to go. It's not that we've got a tactical problem we can write a check for to solve. It's that human behavioral conditions are such that I don't know how to get them to jump over this chasm with me. Now, how many people love chasm jumping? It turns out not that many. Chasm jumping, not a popular sport. And so the leader actually has to become a facilitator of the group deciding how we're going to get there, and then the strongest and most ardent coach and advocate for walking across this chasm. So one day I was on a plane thinking about this problem, and I wrote this. I'm going to explain it to you because otherwise it will not matter to you that I brought it. But when the leader of an organization decides it's time for me to make a major change and announces that to their close circle of leaders, the immediate reaction of that close circle of leaders is not, yippee, we get to do something new. Can I get an amen? It turns out that the first thing that you feel when the executive announces to you that they're going to change things is something we call betrayal, which goes like this. What's wrong with us now? I thought we did a pretty good job. We got lots of A schools. We've got kids making a progressive improvement. Why are things so broken that you want to change something? It's betrayal. And then, based on the fact that the average superintendent life expectancy is 3.4 years in the United States and that the principalship in the United States is a 3-year turn, so that means we turn over the principalship 100% every 3 years in the United States, what does somebody say to themselves? Well, this isn't going to last. The superintendent's initiative, this principal, they're not going to be around. This is called denial. This isn't going to happen. Now, once we work through denial and realize the change is going to happen, the next thing we run into, is an identity crisis, which is, can I do this? Am I the right kind of person for this change anymore? And then eventually, if we kind of work through that identity crisis, we'll start asking questions. Remember agentic engagement? Me asking questions all of a sudden? How can we do this? How can I help do this? That's when somebody's finally kind of gotten to the search for solutions. Now, once that happens with your senior team, and you decide now we're going to take this out to the next layer of the organization, and we announce this change with all happiness, what is the immediate reaction of the next group of people? Betrayal. Back to the beginning. And then what? Denial. And then an identity crisis. And then they begin to help us search for solutions. Then we go announce to our teachers. Now we got the district administrators on board and the building principals are on board. Now we're going to the teachers, teacher leaders and the teachers, and we're going to announce the new change. And what do they feel? The job of a leader in this chain and process is to understand how long and deep this process is and where people are on their journey here. Because chasm walking, as it turns out, is not something that most people enjoy. And in fact, most people are afraid of heights. Have you ever gotten on one of those Indiana Jones bridges and walked out there? And as a leader, I sincerely believe your job is to go and put your arm around that person and help them walk across that bridge. So you better know where they are in this process if you really want people to jump chasms. And jumping chasms is a long process. It's not quick. And a lot of leaders don't have the longevity in service because they're too busy ladder climbing to the next job to stay long enough to see a change through. It will not change in education if we don't stop that. These are the things we're not talking about. So I just want to leave you with the picture. The shadow cultures are the things in the dark that we're not talking about. You know how I know there are shadow cultures? Because every school that I visit and every time we go and I look at the innovation lab and they don't want me to look at any of the classrooms in either direction, you just come to this one classroom, we want to show you how it works here. Isn't that great? Isn't that the future of education? Now let's walk back this way and don't look at anything else. We get all the way back to the other place, right? But sometimes I need to, go to the bathroom or something and I get off to the side and then somebody will put their arm around me and say, let me tell you how it really is around here. Have you ever had that conversation? That's the shadow culture. That's what we have to get up on the table in our schools is the shadow culture. Because chasm walking, as it turns out, is scary and you do it carefully. And you have to be willing to stick it out as a leader with people and understand where they are along the journey. And sometimes they freeze up. In the middle of that gorge, you might freeze up. What's my job as a leader? I'm going to get you. And I'll put my arm around you and I'm going to help you get across this chasm. These are the things we aren't talking about. If you didn't hear me say anything else today, remember you win and you lose at relationship, and that's not just true for the kids. It's true for your staffs. And so with that, I think we're good on time. Great on time. I hope you enjoy Humanizing the Education Machine. If you do, there's a thinking guide actually that comes with this book that you can use for small group discussions if you thought it was helpful in some of your communities and thinking about some of these issues and talking about some of the shadow culture and bringing some of it up. And look for it this winter. We're going to bring out a book and we're going to talk about teacher engagement. I want to give you 2 previews of that. I gave you one today with Kevin Durant and the idea of a teacher athlete and how we take care of our teachers. I'm going to leave you with this thought today. In the 21st century, the social airbags that used to make sure little Johnny stayed on track have started to disintegrate. It used to be that the shopkeeper was watching out for him and my neighbor was watching out for him and the policeman walking down the street was watching out for him and Father O'Shaughnessy was, little Billy, you need to get back on track. I need to see you in church on Sunday. But the social airbags that were there for kids that were experiencing trauma and turmoil in their lives were in place in the communities. Those have all but disintegrated in front of our eyes in the last 30 years. What's left? Who's left? What's the common experience most children are going through still? School. And it turns out in a world of increasing trauma, increasing childhood trauma, our schools have become the field hospitals of the 21st century. Now, we'd like to think, if you've ever seen a field hospital in the modern era, it's this beautiful white tent that's got a nice air conditioning system in it, modern medical equipment plugged into the wall, a well-trained doctor who knows how to do trauma, a nursing staff. If you're going to get shot in combat, you want to go there. We'd love to think that our schools were modern 21st century field hospitals. Here's our problem. I really believe it's more like looking at a Civil War field hospital. The field hospitals of the Civil War were almost overrun with patient load, with people that didn't really have the training to deal with the trauma that they had. We didn't have triage. We didn't have standards of nursing care. Those were things that came out of the Civil War. They weren't things that went into the Civil War. We did it in facilities that weren't particularly suited for what they were doing. And in many cases, we butchered people that went in there, almost worse than when they came in. And to get from a Civil War field hospital to a modern field hospital, we're going to have to address training in dealing with trauma and triage and our technology and our facilities. And if we don't, we will stay stuck as Civil War field hospitals. So you'll do the work, but the work will look more like it did 200 years ago than it does today. So I hope this has been helpful for you in some mental models. Every time I get an opportunity to be in front of you, you are on the front lines. I am proud to work in an industry that helps create habitats for heroes. And that's what you are, and that's what our teachers are. And it's sometimes time to get back to some real honest conversation about how we take care of one another as the means of moving forward. And it's not as complicated as we make it out to be sometimes when we talk about innovation. So thank you for your time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference. I appreciate being here.